Hello, everybody. Welcome to ETM 507, a seminar in technology management, as well as our meetup event in the Technology Management Distinguished Speaker Series. My name is Tim Anderson. I'm the chair of the Engineering and Technology Management Department at Portland State University. And it's going to be my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Keith Hollingsworth. Before we get started on that, I know that some people are taking this as a part of a seminar class. For those of you that are doing so, please remember to upload the speaker report next week to our Canvas assignment for this speaker. And that should be approximately a one-page speaker report. Directions are posted in Canvas. One thing to be sure to do is be sure to include a screen capture showing your name in the list of participants alongside our guest speaker today, Dr. Keith Hollingsworth, as well, or his slides. And so you can do that at any point throughout the presentation. Save that to your computer so you can paste it into your Word document or Google Doc of your speaker report. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Keith Hollingsworth. He's going to be speaking on the subject of entrepreneurship in the African-American community, a way out of no way, a quick look at success, lessons, and future of Black entrepreneurship. And Dr. Hollingsworth is currently visiting professor with the Keller Center at Princeton University, teaching a class on this same subject of Black entrepreneurial history in the U.S. His permanent position is as professor of business administration at Morehouse College, where he's taught for over 28 years now, mainly quantitative analysis and data analytics. And over the past decade, his research has shifted from being a quantitative person with his background in industrial engineering into a variety of additional broader areas of work. And so he's been published in the Journal of Management History. He's taught classes, including a freshman class at Morehouse on this subject. And he has an industrial engineering and systems engineering degree from Georgia Tech for both his PhD, master's, and bachelor's. In fact, that's where I met him years ago when we graduated together in 1995. From Georgia Tech, the #1 school in the country in industrial engineering year after year. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Keith Hollingsworth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. So yes, Dr. Anderson and I were in school together. He didn't have to date us by naming the year, but yes, we were at Georgia Tech together many years ago. And it's a pleasure to see him again and to have all of you here. So my background is industrial engineering, so I do understand technology, but I have worked at Morehouse College. So if you're not familiar with Morehouse, Morehouse is an historically Black college, which in the United States are colleges that started before the Civil Rights era that predominantly served Black people. Morehouse is also the only one of HBCUs that is all male. There are only 3 all-male colleges left in the country, and Morehouse is the only one of those 3 that's historically Black. So we are truly the only college of our kind, not only in this country, but we think pretty much the world. Just in case you're wondering, there's an all-female college right across the street, so that's how we're still able to recruit our students. It is a pleasure to be with you today, and I would ask your attention, please, as I look at this. So Dr. Anderson told me to essentially teach an entire semester in 45 minutes. So get ready. No, I'm joking. We're not going to do that. But I want you to be patient with me understand that we are talking about something that I have taught an entire semester on. So I'm just hitting the high spots today, okay? I'm just hitting some of the basics to give you a sense to think about it. Now, I'm also dealing with Black entrepreneurship in the United States. Okay, many of you are probably not from the United States. You may come from other countries, but take what I'm sharing and think about it in terms of any country. Because I don't care what society you have, there are the haves and the have-nots. There's always going to be a group that's on the outside. There's always a group that faces discrimination. So think about it. You might want to put it in the context of your own country. So what my agenda, I'm going to talk about why bother. I want to start with successes. I want to change our perspective and then think about some of the obstacles and why it's systemic when we talk about systemic racism. And then the future. How can technology help and not hurt? I mean, you are looking at technology management. So I want you to think about this, and we're going to take a few minutes to talk about it. So first of all, why bother? So I believe strongly in the African concept of Sankofa. Sankofa, and you'll often see it as a picture of a bird. Generally, we think of it as a goose or a duck with its head looking backwards, dropping a pebble. And what it says is that you're building on the past. You really can't move ahead without looking back. So if we want to educate the next generation of entrepreneurs, and I'm at the Keller Center here now at Princeton University, the Keller Center on Innovation and Design. It is located in the engineering school at Princeton. And so the reason they're doing this is they're thinking about how systemic racism affects even design. And we're going to touch on that just a little bit here, right? And they're thinking about how if you're going to have people who are innovators, you're going to have these engineers going out and creating new products. How do you do that in an equitable way if you don't recognize how we got here? Right? I mean, one of the things you may have seen on the ad for this this report, currently in the United States, 2.4%, I believe it's 2.4% of employer firms are owned by Black people. Now, that's not sole proprietors. You got to have at least one employee. 2.4%. The overall population, Black people represent 13 to 14%. So they're woefully underrepresented in the entrepreneurial ecospace. Why? Well, part of it, you got to understand the context of how we got here. That's what this class is about. Now, this class was created, and again, I'm hitting some very high level stuff here. I created at Morehouse as a freshman level class that focuses on Black life, history, and culture. I've taught it at several other locations, and now I'm teaching it here at Princeton. Okay, so we want to start with successes. Let's talk about some successes. Because most of you probably haven't heard of that. Okay, so we're going to try something now. I'm going to stop the share for a moment, go to the chat. Let's see how good my technology is. Dr. Anderson, there's a Slido there. What do you think about when you hear the word slave? That's the question. And I want you to go to that link and type in what you think about when you hear the word slave. Okay. Okay, the engineer, good job there. So we're thinking about slaves as in slavery, not as in electronics. Exactly. That's very common. Poverty, suppression, obey, pain. That's what we think about. Here's what I'm not seeing you say. I don't see the words entrepreneur, trader, businessman, skilled. All of these were true. See, we tend to think, if you've watched the movies and everything else, some of my black friends call it, just slavery porn. Because every time you see black movies, it's about slavery. And we often think of slaves as simply brute labor. They worked in the fields from dawn till dusk. Right. In reality, slaves actually participated in a great deal of economic activity. Now, let me put a caveat here. When everything I talk about, I'm in no way minimizing the horrific nature of slavery. Okay, it is what I'm doing is recognizing how slaves sought to survive amid a horrific system. But every time we think of black people in slavery, it doesn't have to be whippings. It doesn't have to be pain. It doesn't have to be the suffering, even though we know it's an awful, awful system. The reality was a people in the midst of a horrific system still found a way to have some independence and autonomy, and it tended to be through economics. Okay. So let's talk about some slave economic activity. Did you know, for example, that slaves brought skills with them that were coveted by their white owners? Again, we tend to think of slaves as brute labor, but the truth is Africa already had extensive markets. They already had guilds. I mean, Africa had cities of 15 to 20,000 people. Did you know that Africans actually controlled the slave trade on the continent? Europeans, up until the late 18th century, wasn't really allowed into the interior. Africans caught the slaves and brought them to the coast and sold them to the Europeans. And I say this not to minimize, again, the horrificness of it. But the point is, they already knew the business of it. Slaves were a product for them. But that's not the only product. They had textiles, they had gold, they had jewelries, they had salt. At one time, salt was traded 1 for gold. They had guilds. There was a tribe called the Akani tribe that had a huge guild and ran it for about 100 years. And then they were taken over by the Asante that were more militaristic, but they kept the roads clear the same way we think about the Romans 2,000 years ago. Okay, think about, for example, rice cultivation, which was in South Carolina and Georgia. Have you ever heard of rice cultivation in Europe? No, nobody in Europe know how to do rice. That was an African trait. And so they would actually buy slaves that knew rice cultivation to put them on the plantation. So most of us don't think that slaves were skilled and would actually be purchased based on their skill sets. Slaves usually produced items on their free time that could be used for sale or barter. Slaves often had plots of land where they grew food for themselves. First of all, slaves were only given at most a half bushel of corn a week and a little bit of salt. That's all they were given to eat. So if they were going to eat more, they had to grow it themselves, and they would often find abandoned plots of land that wasn't good enough for cotton or tobacco, and they would plant their own, or they would go out in the woods and find a clearing and plant it. And if they had surplus, then they would go into town with the owner's permission and sell them at markets. Some slaves would hunt, some slaves would fish. Slaves would often make products such as furniture, baskets, horse collars that could be sold. You say, when do they have time to do this? Well, again, we tend to think of this as being a dawn to dusk thing, but often if it was raining, they'd have to stay in the house. They couldn't work in the fields. They were often given Saturday afternoon and Sundays off. It wasn't unusual that a slave would actually hire themselves out on a Sunday to go work for somebody else. Now, I have to ask the question, can you see my slide? Because it says screen sharing's paused and I don't know how to get it started again. Okay. I'm gonna keep going then. So slaves did this. They brought in these, right? So again, I'm just saying that most slaves used something to bring in income. Okay, we cannot see your screen. Can you help me to figure this out? Let me see if I can do it again. How about now? Should be good. Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, technology people, y'all can make fun of me later. Maybe that's the reason I went into history. The main point is that slaves used business or economics to bring some independence and autonomy amid a degrading system. And we don't think of that. We don't think of Black people having these businesses, being economic, being entrepreneurial. And it actually went even larger than this. This is the very basic stuff. Okay, there's really get to the next slide here. Beyond those basic activities, some demonstrated even greater business skills. For example, there were people called slave entrepreneurs. I'm entrepreneurs versus entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs were given authority to manage the business of their owners. Charles Ball, for example, wrote in 1837, but he was talking about around 1800 to 1810. His master would leave him in charge of the plantation when he was traveling. So the master said, I've got to go back home, or I'm going to buy some, and he would leave the slave in charge of the plantation. He would be the overseer. Juliet Walker, who is sort of the godmother of this entire field, wrote a huge book on Black business in the U.S. history. It's one of the books I use in the class. She estimates 70% of all large plantations had Black overseers. Now, again, in the movies, we don't see this. We always see the overseers as white, but the reality was they were often Black. And if large plantations had Black overseers, then imagine the smaller ones. They couldn't have afforded to go hire somebody else. It was not uncommon for a white owner to allow a Black clerk to run a store. And then you have slave entrepreneurs. They literally rented themselves out. They would buy their time from the owners and then become sole proprietors. So Charles Ball, again, and if you want a fascinating reading, you can look this up. It's free. Dates from 1837. You can download the whole PDF. He wrote about meeting a man in Savannah, Georgia, who paid his owner $250 a year. And then he just ran his own concern. He would load ships in the harbor. He would do various odd jobs. But he just ran his own life as long as every year he'd pay his owner $250. So he, in essence, rented himself out. Free Frank, who, by the way, is Juliet Walker's great-great-grandfather. It's the reason she got into this field. He was an expert in mining, saltpeter mining, which is used to make dynamite. He eventually bought so he rented himself out, ran the mine, made enough money to buy his own freedom, his wife's freedom, and his children's freedom. He eventually started a town in Illinois for free Black people called New Philadelphia. Robert Webster of Atlanta was left behind. His owner became the consul, U.S. consul to Argentina. The problem was if he traveled with his owner to Argentina, Argentina didn't have slavery. So the moment he got there, he'd be free. So the owner wasn't going to run the risk of losing him. So the owner left him behind in Atlanta. Robert Webster had to pay rent for himself. So he'd pay a yearly amount to his owner who was in Argentina. And in the meantime, he was free to run around the town and do what he needed. And he became quite wealthy by the end of the Civil War. By the way, he eventually actually loaned money to his former owner once the war was over. Now, why are we talking about this? Because one of the ways we dehumanize people, one of the ways that we talk about people being less than and gives us permission to discriminate is that we do dehumanize people. We do think of them as other. And so it wasn't uncommon for people to say Black people don't have the intelligence to run a business. Black people don't have the ability to do something. And again, wherever you're from, there's probably somebody in your country that people talk about that way. In In Europe, it's often what we call the gypsy or the Roma. Right? In this country, not only we do it to Black people, we did it to indigenous people. There is this notion of they're savages. We bring civilization to them. They don't have the intelligence to run a business. And what you're seeing here is instead people that in the midst of slavery were actually running businesses, often outsmarting their owners and doing business on the side, sneaking out at night to go buy goods and coming back in the morning. Right? President Taft, I don't have this quote here, but it's in a paper I wrote. President William Howard Taft in the early 1900s was speaking to an audience at a Black school and was talking about why he refused to appoint Black people to positions of authority. And he said, it's just a question of fitness. You wouldn't ask a one-legged man to be a mail carrier. He just doesn't have the ability to do it. So he painted Blackness as a disability. He said, your people were meant to be people of the land. So all of this that I'm saying is just to negate that attitude, which lasted for hundreds of years. After the war, continue to see this. And what you see is Black people use the skills learned in slavery to start businesses. This is when you see even more entrepreneurship. So W.E.B. Du Bois in his report, The Negro in Business in 1899, as a conference at Atlanta University, he talked about this. Those who worked in the fields often became florists or vegetable farmers. Those who worked in the house became barbers, cooks, tailors. Plantation mechanics became wagon drivers, furniture, barrel makers. By the way, I use this to talk to my students. I still believe this. If you're going to run your own business, you got to develop a skill. Okay, all of them want to start a business at the age of 22. I'm like, listen, what can you do that anybody else at 22 can't do? Now, maybe you're fabulous at coding. Dude, that's fantastic. That's a skill. You can build a job out of it. You can build a business out of it. But you need to develop a skill. And this is what we see, that slaves took the skills they had and they developed their businesses. Up until the 1900s, for example, certain industries were dominated by Black entrepreneurs because they were considered low jobs, servile jobs. White people wouldn't be seen doing them. And one, for example, was barbering. You'd be amazed at the number of wealthy Black men who got their starts in barbershops and running barbershops. And by the way, they often would only cut the hair of white people. They would run shops that Black people weren't allowed to come in, but every barber in there would be Black, and they'd be cutting the hair of some of the wealthiest men around. One of the richest people we'll talk about later, who started a major company in Durham, North Carolina, he cut the hair of Mr. Duke, who founded, but gave the money for Duke University. And Mr. Duke is the one who told him, you ought to start an insurance company, and he did, and it became a huge success. Right, so barbers, food service. There wasn't that many. First of all, we didn't have a middle class for a long time, but there wasn't that many white women who really knew how to cook. I mean, poor women like my ancestors knew how to make cornbread and bacon and beans and a few other things, but they weren't making fancy food. And if you were rich enough to afford fancy food, you weren't the ones cooking it. You had white people cooking it for you. So they actually dominated. The first caterer was a Black man in Philadelphia, Robert Bogle. I call it the crap factor. They did crap nobody else wanted to do. By the way, this is a hint. This is how I tell people it's how I got tenure. I did the crap nobody else wanted to do around the department. So when I came up for tenure, they were like, if he leaves, who's going to do all the work he's been doing? And so I have tenure. The Black community also, one of the things I'm teaching my students is they often came together, support each other through mutual aid societies, benevolent societies, often focused around the church. I think it's fascinating. I'd love to learn more about it. Many of you, I'm sure, know more about it, but the American culture is so individualistic. We celebrate, the millionaires. We celebrate Bill Gates and forget everybody who helped him. We celebrate Steve Jobs and forget the others who helped him. We celebrate Michael Jordan and don't remember the other 4 people on the team. We're such an individualistic culture that is simply not true of other cultures. And one of those truly is the African community and the Black community. They really were taking care of themselves. There's a whole theory I'd love to get into called the middleman theory, but I won't do it today. And then we move up into the golden age of Black business. Dr. Walker, again, is the one who dubbed it this way. And how did we get there? We got there because of two things: Jim Crow laws and Great Migration. So for those of you who don't know, Jim Crow laws were the laws that came about in the South that segregated white and Black people. They're the ones that said Black people had to get on the back of the bus. They're the ones that said Black people and white people couldn't use the same water fountain, couldn't use the same restrooms. It was so bad in Atlanta at one point that Black and white people could not be on the elevator together. If Black people were on an elevator and a white person got on, the Black people had to get off and wait for the next one. Okay, those were Jim Crow laws. People think it started right after the Civil War. It didn't. It didn't start till around 1900. First, you had to get a lot of political power taken care of. You had to suppress voting rights first, which they did. Then they started passing these laws. So it became harder and harder to be Black in the South. At the same time, the North, which had shut down on immigration, needed more and more people for industrial jobs. And so you have the Great Migration. In 1900, about 90% of Black people were in the South in rural places. By 1960, so within 60 years, probably 50 to 60% of Black people were in the North and in urban communities. So there's two parts of the Great Migration. Part of it was Black people leaving the South, going to the North, the Midwest, and the West. And part of it is moving from rural to urban. In 1900, if you saw a Black person, you would have assumed they were rural. 9 out of 10 were. By the time you get to 1970, 8 out of 10 are urban. So it was a major shift. But what did this do? Why did this help create Black businesses? Because it created a significant market. Think about this. Think about it from a business point of view. If you're a Black person, you're trying to start a business, most of your customers are probably going to be Black because of Jim Crow laws, because Jim Crow laws are making everything segregated. Not a lot of white people are heading downtown to shop at Black businesses. So your audience is Black people, but if 90% of them are living on random farms throughout the South, you don't have enough market to have a good sized business. You can have a mom and pop business. You can have 1 and 2 employees, but you're not going to really grow. But when this group of people suddenly moved to Detroit, New York, and Atlanta, when the rural people move into the city, and by the way, the conditions in the cities were often awful. You'd have 6 or 7 people in a room. Okay, you wouldn't have sewers. Disease was rampant, but you still had at least a market. You now had a significant Black population in a small area. So now you could start building bigger businesses. And that's what you began to see. The first large Black businesses: North Carolina Mutual Insurance, Standard Life Insurance, Atlanta Life Insurance. This is outside the scope of this. Sometime if you're interested, ask me. I'd love to tell you why insurance was the first major Black business, but it was. Then you have cosmetics. Poro was run by a woman named Annie Turnbow Malone. At one time between 1910 and 1920, she had 70,000 people working for her. She started what we think of as what happens now with Avon and Mary Kay. She trained women to go sell to other women. And so she really started that model. Madam C.J. Walker, many of you have probably heard more about her. She worked for Poro and then went out on her own and started her own. Hygienic Manufacturing was another makeup place for Black women. Banks, St. Luke Penny Savings Bank was in Richmond. Maggie Lena Walker was there. Merchants and Farmers Bank was in Durham with North Carolina Mutual. You began to have successful Black neighborhoods. Greenwood, Oklahoma, which was Tulsa, Oklahoma. Dollars in Greenwood would circulate 8 to 10 times before leaving. It was a prosperous Black neighborhood. Anybody know what happened to Greenwood? In 1921, a massacre occurred. It was completely burned to the ground. About 300 people died. But before then, it was quite large. Durham, North Carolina was huge. It was called Haiti, named after the country, but spelled differently. Significant Black population there. Bronzeville, which is a part of Chicago. Sweet Auburn, which is in Atlanta, Georgia. You really had, so you think about Atlanta for a moment. Y'all are probably not familiar with it. Dr. Anderson is, because we were there in Atlanta together. I stayed. Atlanta had a significant population. First of all, there are 4 to 5 historically Black colleges in Atlanta. There was Morehouse College, there was Clark College, Atlanta University, Spelman College, Morris Brown College. So you had, not only did you have businesses like Atlanta Life and Standard Life Insurance, but you had Black doctors, you had Black lawyers, you had Black professors, you had Black clergymen, you had big Black churches. You really had a Black neighborhood with a Black middle class. This had not occurred before. You finally had a large enough population to do this. Now try to imagine, if you will, why this matters. I heard a woman speak one time who was involved with the civil rights struggle. And she said those who grew up in Atlanta, like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., they got protected from some of the indignities of Jim Crow because they could live in a Black neighborhood. They didn't have to go to a white pharmacist to be treated rudely. They had a Black pharmacist. They didn't have to get on the bus and sit at the back because they could walk to the schools they needed. They had to go Black doctors. They could shop in their own stores. They didn't have to go to the theater and be forced to go to the balcony because they had Black theaters. So they were protected, and it gave them a confidence that later when they grew older and you get to the civil rights era, it meant they were less likely to step back and tolerate the abuses that had been occurring. So it's important to see these successes. Again, we tend not to think of them. If you're outside the Black community, most people have never heard of them. But they existed and they were prominent. But now, so those are the successes, but let's talk about some of the obstacles. And I want to get you a sense of, you're engineers, most of you, you're into technology. I want you to think about how this is systemic, okay? First of all, let's think about what happened after the war. Okay. Just imagine, and I've never thought about this, but imagine that the slaves, you know, you're on this plantation, the Union Army comes by and says, you're free. Okay, great. Now, what does that mean? It was illegal to teach slaves to read or write, so you had no education. You had no money. I mean, you had a little bit of economic activity. We've talked about it, but not enough. What are you going to do? The land's not yours. Where do you go? And you're surrounded by white people who are mad they just lost the war and think you should be slaves still. I don't think many of us think about how destitute they really were. You know, I have taught a version of this class in a local prison. They understood. Because people who get out of prison often struggle because you've spent 20 years, let's say, being told when to go to bed, when to get up, when to eat, in a very structured environment, and suddenly you're free and you can do what you want to, and it freaks people out. I mean, they don't want to go back to jail, but it's not easy. So you're a slave. You've been told when to get up, when to go to bed, when to go to the field, when not. I mean, and suddenly you're free. It was a difficult thing. One Northern general suggested breaking up the plantation of rebellious Southerners and giving every freed slave 40 acres. You may have heard the phrase 40 acres and a mule. The mule was added later. He was going to give everybody 40 acres, so at least they'd have something to start with. But President Johnson at the time shut down that idea. He said it was in effect affirmative action. It'd be unfair to give that advantage to black. Now, they've just gotten out of slavery, hundreds of years of slavery. Yeah, we don't want to help them. They're free. What else do they want? They need to start earning their living just like the poor white people do. If this sounds familiar, it should, because you could see the same language in today's newspapers. And, what else can we do? We've already had a black president. What else do you want? This ignores, by the way, at the same time, 3 homesteads are being given out west. But no, we can't do that. So, so one way to help this, all the black people were out there, they didn't have anything to do, was they created the Freedmen's Bank. Freed slaves were encouraged to save money. Very successful in that. Bank handled $75 million from 75,000 depositors. That's $1.5 billion in today's dollars. Now, again, I just told you to think about how poor these people were. And yet they were able to save $75 million in the first decade. That's how much they believed in this, because the US government at the time, think about it, black people would have loved the US government. They just came in and said, you're free. They just ended slavery. But they screwed them over. First of all, the bank was hobbled from the start. It was a savings bank, not a regular bank. In essence, it was a big piggy bank. They weren't going to invest the money at first. They weren't going to pay interest. It was just put your money in and save it. It wasn't a bank like we think of it today where you get paid interest or it's loaned out. They didn't use that money to loan out and help black people start businesses. They just had a savings bank. But they got so much money that they suddenly said, hey, we do need to invest this money. But who invested it? The white leaders. And they invested in their brother-in-law's railroad stock and lost everything. Nobody was held accountable. Nobody ever went to jail. Nobody was ever punished. All that money just disappeared. The government did nothing to make this right. In today's world, we have something called the Federal Deposit Investment Corporation, the FDIC. No, Federal Deposit and Insurance Corporation, excuse me, FDIC. They insure deposits in banks if banks follow certain rules. So that if the bank goes under, I still get my money. This did not exist at the time, even though this was a federal bank. Du Bois said 10 more years of slavery would not have been as damaging. Why am I talking about this? Because black mistrust of banks lasted for more than a century. They never forgot this. Here's another one. Soon after the Great Depression, Congress established the Federal Housing Administration. The FHA agreed to stand behind mortgage loans, I should put that in there, that match certain criteria. This is why so many people in the country today own their own homes, because of the FHA. Because banks now had a lot less risk because the government was going to back it up and support it. The government's assuming the risk for mortgages. Mortgages boomed across the country, but part of the criteria dealt with the riskiness of the loan. So this committee called the HOLC created maps where every neighborhood was rated from green, which was low risk, to red, which was high risk. Guess what? Every neighborhood with a significant black population was denoted red. Every single black neighborhood was considered high risk. That's why we call it redlining, because neighborhoods were drawn red. The survey form they used specifically asked how many percent were foreign born, how many percent were Negro. What did this mean? 98% of all these loans, look at the first sentence, mortgages boomed across the country. Yeah, for white people. 98% of all FHA loans over these 34 years were to white homeowners. I just want to throw this in there. Some people, there's controversy whether HOLC or FHA are more to blame for the practice, but that doesn't matter for this discussion. The point was the same. Why am I bringing this up? Think about this. Think about the impact of having your neighborhood declared high risk. You cannot access FHA loans for a mortgage, which means you have to pay more down payment. You have to pay higher interest rates. Your house is not worth as much. You won't be able to sell it for as much. In every way possible, it lowers the wealth of the homeowner. Low property values meant low property taxes. So you get poorer schools, you get less parks, you get less infrastructure, which continues to depress values. What happens if black people moved into a white neighborhood? The neighborhood's now considered risky. Once you got over a certain percentage of black, it became a risky neighborhood, according to the government. And therefore, the value of all property in the neighborhood began to drop. So white people would be furious if black people moved in. They would burn crosses. Not that I'm saying this is right. I'm just saying that it had an effect. 90 years later, the majority of places marked red. So we're in 2020. This happened in 1930. 90 years later, the majority of places marked red in 1930 are still low income. Here's what you've got to consider, students. When you think about your role, this is your responsibility. I'm at the end of my career. This is for you to think about. This is systemic. Here's what I mean. This is how I use redlining to discuss systemic racism. Because you may say to yourself, I don't dislike black people, or I don't dislike indigenous people, I don't dislike Hispanics, or whatever group in your country is the group. You may say, I treat everybody the same. Good for you. You should do that. My daddy tried to teach me that too. But think about how it builds in. This started in the mid-1930s. So now let's say I'm in the early 1960s. I'm an analyst. I'm getting ready to make a loan. I don't know why they made the rule in 1930. I've never looked at it. I may be 20-something years old. I wasn't even born in the 1930s. But here I am in 1960s. All I know is this neighborhood's risky. So I'm not going to make a loan to a risky place. And in fact, I'll probably get awarded for being a good steward of the bank's money. Why would I be giving loans to risky places? I don't know where it came from. Is it possible black neighborhoods were riskier in the 1960s? It's not impossible, it's probable. Because if you've had 3 decades of low investment, low property values, of course the community would not be as nice. And that's not even counting the decades of underinvestment. You go through this country, sewers, black neighbors were the last to get sewers, the last to get schools, the last to get paved roads. You keep not investing. And then you turn around and blame people because your neighborhood doesn't look good. But the problem is for you and I, we came later. I mean, when I grew up in the rural South, I've seen all this, but even when I went to school, the schools were integrated. They integrated just before I started, by the way. But the schools were integrated. I grew up in that. But I didn't recognize all the ways the decisions have been made leading up to this. Well, you might say, what about black banks? Weren't there black banks? Yeah, there were black banks. Couldn't they make mortgage loans? Sure they could. But think about it. Where are the black banks making loans? They're making loans in the black neighborhoods. That's where they're, well, if 90% of their loans are in black neighborhoods, then who's going to look at their portfolio of loans? What you going to think? They're risky because they're all in risky neighborhoods. This is systemic. This is how it gets built in, and nobody knows why it got created that way. And why do these obstacles affect entrepreneurship? Why do I talk about it? Because access to credit, right? The relationships between banks and the black community have been problematic for over a century. Numerous studies have been shown that black customers do not get the same access to credit as white customers. Even outside of pure racism, a community that's often unbanked has lower values to home and so forth, so they're less likely to get credit. Even in the recent pandemic, black businesses are far less likely to get PPP loans. Access to wealth. At the first round of fundraisings from friends and family, what is the effect when the average black wealth is only 10%, not 10% less, 10%? The average white wealth in this country is 180,000. The average black wealth is 18,000, 1/10. A major part of that is home ownership. Decades of undervaluing due into the redlining that occurred to 1930. I don't know if you've seen the stories in the paper recently. If not, I would encourage you to look at it. There are several stories that came out recently that said that there were Black people trying to sell their home, and they got it appraised and they got a value. They then went through their house and took out every picture that had a Black person in it. Went and bought some random frames with white people in it that you can buy at Walmart, put those around the house. Had a white friend come in and sit in the house and had another appraiser come through and got another $70,000 to $80,000 worth of value. Now, I grew up in the rural South. I told you that. You may say, I don't see race. You do. I'm sorry. We all do. I've spent almost 30 years working at a Black school. I have more Black friends than white friends. But the reality is we still see race. It is still built in our system. And if you don't acknowledge that, my friends, sorry, I need to get off my soapbox. But I think if you don't acknowledge that, then you can't act to stop it. Is by recognizing that people are tribal, by recognizing that people automatically get into insider, outsider. We see it in this country right now. We see it with everything from Democrats, Republicans, Christians, non-Christians, Black, white, you name it. There's so many ways we make people into the other that we have to think about how we handle that. Now, here's my challenge to you. I don't get to grade your papers, but I would encourage you in your paper that you have to write, those of you who are in the class, to think about this. Okay. How are you, if you are going to use technology, if you're an engineer, you're trying to fix problems in this life, how are you going to try to change this? There's some advantages to current technology. So remember the golden age of Black business. We said it was created because suddenly you had significant Black markets. Suddenly Black populations, Black business had a sufficient population to create these big markets. Well, we got that now. E-commerce is recreating this. Black businesses are no longer restricted to their own geographic location. They're not restricted to this country. They can now access an extremely large Black market worldwide. And one hopes that certainly white people are more likely to buy from Black businesses than they would have been in the Jim Crow days. I do believe that's true. But even if you're primarily advertising toward Black businesses, now you have a huge population that's allowed through e-commerce. That's fantastic. That is a great opportunity for people. You have the opportunity now for discriminated minority groups to have access to markets they never had before. And you no longer have to move to the big city to get a sufficient market. Now they can live in a rural town and still have that market. That is technology opening the doors for us. Technology is helping a lot of people. So I'll tell you, I'm gay. I've moved to a big city that has a very significant gay population, but many gay people in rural towns really felt isolated. The internet's opened them up. They're now able to talk to other gay people around the world so they can still live in a rural town, but not feel so isolated and so alone. That's a huge advantage for a minority discriminated population. Second thing, big data, for example. I teach a class on data analytics. Big data allows us to recognize systemic discrimination in a way that was not true before. I mean, the truth is, you go back to these small rural banks, Black person comes in for a loan prior to like 1968, sometime around there. May not have the exact date. Prior to 1968, the bank manager could just look at this Black person and go, no. You didn't have to check their credit. You didn't have to do anything. You could just say no because they were Black. That's now against the law in this country. We still see it happening, but it's against the law. But how would you know it? How would you know that these banks were discriminating? You wouldn't see it. That's not true anymore. We could download now almost every loan given across the entire country. We got the computing power now to analyze it. Now we can find out whether appraisals are less in some neighborhoods or not. We can now check that in a neighborhood, given all other factors, what's happened. So big data allows us to highlight things that we would never have known. It is shining a light on things that we never knew. Transparency. Here's some disadvantages. Now, listen, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not an expert. So if I say something in the next few minutes and you're like, Dr. Hansworth, you don't know how it works, fine. Feel free to send me an email, let me know. I am not trying to claim to be an expert on technology. That's you guys. Y'all know far more than I do. But I do know some things. I think about these algorithms that we use. Think about the algorithms that help you find what you want on Google. During the pandemic, I was gonna order groceries from Kroger, which is our grocery store, and have them delivered. And they had me put in my little plus card. Ooh, I was amazed. They knew exactly what I bought all the time. Right? You got all these algorithms that help you, but the algorithms reflect current reality. Let me give you an example. If you get a chance, you can read a book called Algorithms of Oppression. It's about 10 years old. Let's tell me where we're looking at. Algorithms of Oppression. Because the woman said, if you looked up the words black women, the first 10 sites were porn. And she complained about it, and Google said, but that's just what people want. I mean, the algorithm reflects what people search. And she said, I don't care. You change other algorithms. You don't allow child porn to come up. If that's what they want, they might can go look for it, but just the words black women shouldn't automatically go to porn. What message are you sending? So it shows the most popular site. It looks for our online habits. It uses data about us to make assumptions, but is it true? Isn't it true? And again, that this might allow current biases to be baked in. Given now that most black people live near other black people, should Zillow only show black people homes in black neighborhoods? Because that's just digital redlining. If you assume a black person wants to live near other black people, is the algorithm sending them there? Is that good? The percent of black PhDs is low. So should a career site not show those grad school options to black candidates? When a black person searches a good career option, it doesn't show them PhDs because after all, black people tend not to get PhDs. You see, if you reflect current reality, you're ignoring 100, 200 years of history that put us in this position. If you say black neighborhoods are not as nice, that may be true. The average black neighborhood may not be as nice as the average white neighborhood. But why? Because of redlining. Because of 150 years of underserved. So are you reflecting a reality that's already got biases built in? How do you fix that? I don't know. That's why I called this a challenge, by the way, because I don't know the answer to this. What happens when the assumptions are wrong? So I sometimes in my class, I do a search on my name. You should always Google your name every once in a while to see what shows up. And there are sites that'll tell you, all sorts of personal details about me. And so it's got my birth date. It names my brother, my sister. It names a stepmother that daddy divorced. It shows a stepmother. My father divorced her 30 years ago, and he died 10 years ago, and it still shows her name. It shows where I work. It assumes I'm a Democrat. It assumes I'm a Christian. But one of the funniest things is it says he's an African American. So my students always get a big kick out of that because they're like, Doc, you've worked at a black college so long, people think you're black. But I do. I've worked at a black college. I've lived in a neighborhood that was black until gentrification hits about 3-4 years ago. And so when you look at my voting habits, when you look at where I live and you look at where I work, the system assumes I'm black. I make the joke to my students, and again, I'm at a black college, but I'm like, hey, according to Google, I'm losing my white privilege. Imagine if they now look at, and I'm saying this is horrible. I'm saying it as a joke, but it's horrible. Suppose I apply for something, the system makes it look like I'm black, and therefore I get marked down. So the question to you is, how do you make that change? Because technology can be helpful. But there are ways that if you're not careful, the technology builds in biases that are already there. And that's why I do think teaching this type of history is important. it is good to get rid of preconceived notions. It is good to think about the successes that I've talked about. It is good to see some of the obstacles that occurred and some of the ways people have been screwed over. Again, in this country, we talk about Black people, but I could just as easily do this on Hispanic. I could do it on Indigenous. In your country, there may be a different group. But how has the system done this? And now how are these being built into the technologies of today? And man, I can look at where broadband is at. Is not in the neighborhoods that were redlined. I can look where the parks are. I can look where Starbucks is. I was quoted in an article a few years ago. And I said, in Atlanta, you'd have to know Atlanta, but there was no Starbucks south of Interstate 20. There is a line separating the white north from the black south. You don't find Starbucks in the south. Some of that's changed now. How does technology, how does these systems, and that's what the Keller Center is trying to do, why they brought me here. Some of the other things that they're looking at innovation. They're saying, how can we create innovative ideas that don't just build on systems that were already discriminatory? I thank you for your time. I forgot how much time I had. I think 7:15 was the worst. But I'm open to any, if you have any questions while I'm still here, how much time you have. So.
This was an excellent talk. Thank you very much. And we still have time for questions. So if there's questions, please feel free to either type them in the chat or people are welcome to unmute themselves and ask any questions. So I will kick it off. I mean, do you think that this presents new opportunities for things getting better? I mean, do you see things improving over the next 10 years, or do you think the technology will make things even worse?
Okay, but I have to answer that question as a white man. So, I mean, I'm just honestly, I have to answer that question as a white man. I think things are getting better. I really do. And by the way, that's the one thing that my students put, by the way, class, I always start my class with, I know I'm a white man teaching this subject. I will never tell you I know what it's like to be Black in America, because I don't. I know what it's like to be poor. I can talk about that one. I can talk about a few other ones, but I don't know about being Black. So I don't ever try to take on that approach. But I do think it's getting better. The racism of my grandparents compared to the attitudes of my parents, compared to the attitudes that I have, compared to the attitudes of the friends of my children, the children of my friends, I see things getting better. I do think the internet exposes us to more things. I think people are far more aware of differences now than we used to be. So the same thing that prevents. So I do think attitudes are getting better. I think we have to be cautious that we don't take things backwards. I mean, we're seeing the problem now with, Facebook and Instagram and everything, which I think are great things. I love, okay, I confess, I like Facebook, which I know shows my age. But the reason I like Facebook is because I'm allowed now to talk to my high school friends and my family and cousins and everything that I used not to talk to. So it allows me to build connections. I keep up with my former students and I know how well they're doing through Facebook. So I think that's a great thing. But we also see how people are using Facebook to spread hate. It's a tough thing, but I do think attitudes are getting better, but I think they're getting better very slowly. But compared to my grandparents, I mean, I tell my students, when I read about slavery, when I read about people getting on the back of the bus, I can't help but see life today being better. But it's just not where we want to be.
Yep.
Do you see any tech startup which tried to be inclusive in recent time? No. We've got a multitude of people who have gone to some of the big startups. But we're getting the news now out of the Googles and the Facebooks and everything, that they're not as inclusive as they thought. And, you know, the problem is, so after George Floyd murder, I will tell you at Morehouse, you'd be amazed at the number of companies that tried to come recruit our students. Because they're suddenly like, we need some Black people. So let's go to the Black school and get somebody. But that's not sufficient. Here's a challenge for all of you. Okay, so we're gonna get real here. I maybe should turn off the recorder. No, I'm kidding. Okay, some of you probably understand this better than I do. Years ago, let's say 20 years ago, a good friend of mine, my mentor at Morehouse, invited me to his house for a fish fry. Man, it was fabulous. We had fried fish, fried shrimp, fried onion rings, French fries, fried pies. We'd have fried the tea if we could have got away with it. It was great. Free base and cholesterol. But I was the only white person in the house. Now, to somebody from the rural South, that was different. Now, everybody was happy to see me. I was welcome. We all got along great, but it still felt funny to me. I would encourage you, if you've never done it, go to a Black church sometime. Go to a place where people will love to see you, be glad to have you there, probably send you a plate home full of food. But you'll still feel funny. Because you might say, so most people don't, and especially white people in the United States, do not understand what it means to be a minority. You maybe do. So the idea that somebody can come into your office and you say, I treat them the same way I treat everybody else, and not understand that they still may feel like they don't belong. It is possible to go to a place where everybody's as nice as they can be and you still don't feel like you belong. So it takes patience and it takes time. And you have to build that up. And I'm not sure many companies know how to do that. You can't just hire one Black person and feel like they're going to feel like they belong. They don't. I've seen when it comes to boards, you need at least 3 Black people on a board. Putting one person on your board, one Black person on your board is not going to help you. Because that one Black person then has to bear the brunt of representing all Black people. That's too much. And they're going to be intimidated not to speak out because they may lose their place. You need at least 3 to have enough confidence that they can stand up and say, this is not accurate. So me saying that doesn't mean that there aren't some out there, but have I just heard of it? No, I have not. The ones I've heard of are still struggling to get this right. Let me tell you, the banks are struggling. It's an issue, but we got to talk about it.
Great. Any other questions? Looking in the chat, not seeing anything else popping up. And so we'll make the recording available for people that are taking this for credit. It'll appear in our Canvas Zoom listing. And I mean, again, I want to thank you, Dr. Hollingsworth, very much for giving a talk. And it's a neglected area of entrepreneurship research, as well as a neglected area in the technology community to try to explore this. So I really appreciate your coming in and giving us a speech here. And it's always a joy to hear your presentations. So everyone, please join me in giving Dr. Hollingsworth a nice round of applause. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation. It's good to see you again, sir.
Yep. Okay. Thanks. Have a great weekend.